Awesome. I just realized that my phone and my stopwatch isn't near me. Give me literally a sec to get that. Okay, awesome. Two only housekeeping rules, actually three rules. Number one, everyone who is an observer, please stay muted and please avoid like using the chat. Secondly, I will keep the time, but I will not write the timestamps in the chat since I'm a bit incompetent. If one of my panelists could do that, that's lovely. If not, that's completely okay. Everyone should time themselves.
Am I the only one who can't hear Marta?
Yeah. Sorry. My Zoom like went out for a sec, but I'm fine now. Yeah, I will keep the time, but not write the timestamps in the chat. And secondly, I think the default rule for POIs is you write them in a chat unless the speaker states any other preference at the top of their speech. With that being said, I'm extremely happy to welcome the opening government here and the Prime Minister.
Hi, can I be seen and heard? Okay. I'd prefer PIs in the chat, please. And I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, those in low socioeconomic areas are the ones who the government needs to prioritize the most, because they are the ones that the government has left behind in their mission to try and give everybody the best quality of life possible. We say education is one of the key mechanisms historically and contemporarily to bring people out of poverty, to give them the quality of life that they deserve. And therefore, we are very proud to say that we would implement a teacher draft program. This is how supposed motion. We're not going to model it too much, but we think it's generally intuitive that obviously university students will know that this is going to happen at the point at which they get into university. So it's probably informed at the point at which they get into university and they like graduate at the top of their class, so on and so forth. Two things in the PM speech. Firstly, that the government has a principal duty to implement this draft. Secondly, and most importantly, that this transforms lower socioeconomic areas in a way that is positive for the lives of those who live there. Firstly, then, on why they have a principal duty to do this. The first thing to establish is that governments have a right to mandate this teacher draft of students for one of 3 reasons, at least. Firstly, very often, the education that you received is because of state funding directly. Secondly, often the university that you went to was a direct result of it being created by the state or the state like investing in the creation of that university. Thirdly, even if all this is not the case, often the socio-political climate that led to the university existing and you getting the good education that you receive, specifically good education, given that they've graduated in the top 5% of their class, means that the government has given you the opportunity to be able to get that education. So we have a right to say students should give back because of the privilege of the education that they have received. But even if this is not true, we say that even if on some hypothetical scenario, we are taking away the rights of students, that is fine, and we are willing to take that trade-off. Because the highest priority of the government should be the lower economic areas, that is to say the people who live there. Why is this the case? Because these are direct and explicit failure of the state when you have a lower quality of life as compared to the rest of the country that you live in, because the government has failed to invest in that area, because the government has been negligent in the way, for example, they have economic policies or they tax people and give back to those areas. We say the government is complicit in this, and therefore they must give to these individuals in every way possible. The teacher draft is one of those ways that is principally consistent with that principle. Most importantly then, and the second extension or second argument we have, why we transform lower socioeconomic areas, this is where we're going to give you all the mechanisms and all the benefits. Firstly, we think it's intuitive to say that while these individuals are within these like low socioeconomic areas, they're going to try and do as much as they can for these areas because they're socially responsible, because they've gained like a good education, because they want to make the most of their time there. And even if they're just not really nice people, the more that they do there, the better it looks on their CV, especially like you graduated top of your class, the more you did for a particular place. Everything is generally within every incentive that they have, given that they're going to spend 2 years there anyway, to do as much as they can. And even if they don't do as much as they can, we think the benefits are going to be like pretty substantial either way. What are the benefits? First and foremost, you're going to have good teachers doing a lot of good things there. What does this look like? It looks like a lot of networking opportunities for that area. Often when you graduate at the top of your class, you've made really good and strong networks with other people at the top of your class, with other universities, with experts in the field that you studied in, so on and so forth, who are able to now get down to that area and assist you in your teaching or assist you in developing infrastructure or developing like a lot of things that are generally beneficial for that area. Secondly, it looks like investment. It looks like being able to bring your own social economic capital, to bring your own political capital, to bring more individuals who you have connections with to literally invest in that area monetarily. It looks thirdly like a better investor confidence, because they know that the human capital who is there are capable individuals who are able to like produce results, who have already graduated up the field, because they are confident that there are good individuals there. Investors are more likely to go into those areas. Fourthly, it looks like expertise. It looks like people knowing what they're doing and what they're teaching and are able to teach it really well to the students who are there. Often this looks like being able to voice your issues strongly and having the political and social capital to do so. Often the structural issues in low socioeconomic areas are things to do with policy. For example, like less salaries, like very low salaries of teachers there, or less infrastructure bills there. When you have people with higher amount of social and political capital in those areas, they can voice those issues and have the capability and expertise to do so, and therefore they're more likely to change things there. And finally, even if all this is not true, they generally can bring more attention to this issue. They can bring media, they can bring any other person who has a lot of political capital or social capital in that area. All this means that good teachers make incredible amount of changes to this area, both not in terms of the field that they have studied in, but in general, the socio-economic landscape of the education system in that area. Further impacts then. What does this change for the students on the ground? It looks like broadly three things at the point at which you receive education from somebody who has graduated at the top of their field. Firstly, it inspires them at the point at which they know that they have a really, really smart individual teaching them. They are likely to want to do better themselves. Secondly, it gives them a role model who they can explicitly model their own behavior and education off of. That is to say, you know exactly what you want to be and how to get there. You can get the expertise. You can speak to the teacher on a one-on-one basis, especially poor students who are successful in university, who go and teach poor students in these areas, now literally know that they can be capable and that they can benefit despite being poor. Thirdly, they learn the field really well. So if an engineering student comes and teaches like mathematics and and applied concepts in high school, for example, secondary schools, and the person who learns these concepts learns them really well, they are more likely to get into the best university in the country, get into good fields of education, and are later on able to access the networks that these experts provide to them later on in life. We think that these students benefit massively off them. Before I move into impacts and weighing, I'll take a POI from closing opposition. You're muted.
Sorry. Look, I think most of the skills you learn as a university student at the top of your class are things like knowledge retainment and research. And those are the metrics metrics by which you are assessed on your success. Why then does that enable you to be the best possible teacher, specifically in these areas of low socioeconomic productivity, especially when these kids require more than strictly education?
When you graduate at the top of your field, you have more than just knowing how to do research. That also really, really helps because you can teach those skills and teach your field in general, as I've already explained to you. The fact that you graduate top of your skills means that you have networking opportunities. You've done internships, for example. There are a lot of things that come on top of your field. We don't think that this is like a great point in general. Finally, impacts. One, you create better literacy rates and education in those areas. This means that more people can get employment, they can start businesses, you can create thriving economies, not just because you are teaching specific students because you have a good teacher, but because the effects of that ripple out and trickle down, as I've already explained and mechanized to you. You're more likely as a student in that area to give back to that area. One, because you have the knowledge and capability to do so, but you also feel a greater connection to the place that you received your primary or secondary education, because you recognize that it gave you an opportunity to interact with one of the best minds in your country. On weighing, this is the stakeholder. Lower socioeconomic areas is the stakeholder that needs to be prioritized the most. So any other benefit that any other team gives you cannot be compared to the fact that the state has the greatest the greatest obligation to these individuals, and we have given it the reason and the impacts as to why we benefit them the most. For all these reasons, side with opening government.
We thank the speaker for the speech, and I'm super happy to welcome the leader of the opposition. Here.
Two things in my speech. 2 points about how this does not lead to better teaching, and a principle and practical case for why forcing teachers to do this is not a good thing. But first, to respond to the proposition. So we agree completely with their metric that education is most important in this. Whoever gets the best out of education, we agree. Okay, so let's look at their principal point. So they tell us that there is a right for the state to mandate teachers to do things because those teachers gain from what the state gave them. Firstly, notice that these teachers never consented to be given this. Often free tuition, for example, for universities is not like consented to, you're simply given it. And therefore we see this is akin to a charity offering someone, like helping them, and then saying, you must now work for us. We see this as an absurd principle. Then we're told their practical case about how they transform these areas. Firstly, we were told that these teachers would do it and stuff because it looked good in their CV, etc. And they would kind of help out in the community. We tell you these people aren't necessarily altruistic, and also the point at which you're forcing them to do this, there's a likely backlash. Then we heard a huge amount about the idea of networks and personal capital. First response is the fact that these people are very young. They're not kind of like middle-aged adults who've worked all their life, who have lots of networks. They're just uni students that have spent a lot of time in the library. And therefore we see, because they're very young, they don't have many networks. And also, because they've been academic rather than necessarily social at university, they do actually not have the same networks that someone that did less well at university did. Then we were told this very strange part about how suddenly investor confidence is going to rise in these low socioeconomic areas. We tell you that investors never look at teachers to kind of base their decisions off. This doesn't really stand. Then we were told that these teachers, because they were so amazing, become inspiring role models. Firstly, we tell you that, like, is academic success the only thing we should be telling children that's important? We tell you that actually a teacher that is more rounded, possibly, who came middle of their university year, is probably a better overall role model rather than someone who's incredibly smart and largely spent most of their time in the library, etc. We also tell you that this only acts as a role model for children who are already smart. They will only want to engage with someone who's incredibly smart because they've already invested in this. This does nothing but alienate those who are not within mainstream education doing well. We tell you this is worst in low socioeconomic areas where their education has already been harmed already, so they find it even harder to engage. Okay, now to my 2 points. Firstly, how does this not actually lead to the best teachers? This leads largely from my rebuttal, which is the fact that this is only the top 5%, and therefore they are very academic. We tell you, firstly, this is not required because high school is not an incredibly high level. We tell you, as under the status quo, most teachers can teach, or most graduates can teach their subject at a high school level. We tell you that incredibly intelligent teachers, because they are so intelligent, find it difficult to understand pupils who may not be as intelligent as they are, and therefore are unable to bring up pupils who are not as intelligent. Therefore, their teaching is worse. Many people at university will understand this listening to their lecturers giving lectures. It's not very good. Lots of issues within secondary schools are behavioral. We tell you, not as a generalization, but it is very often the case that people in low socioeconomic schools don't like education because it has been so bad. Therefore, we see it is more likely that behavior in these schools will be bad, and therefore, I mean, you can look empirically at evidence of this, and therefore we see that incredibly academic teachers are not good at dealing with this, and also we see this is a waste of the precious resources that the Prime Minister was talking about. Notice so far how I have only talked about high school teachers. The other side of this, which they did not really engage with, was the fact that this also applies to primary school teaching. Firstly, we tell you that primary school teaching requires a huge amount of specialist training that's not specified in this. So we see that for this to work, they would have to have additional training. And also, primary school teaching has very little to do with academics. It's about bridging the gap between nursery education and secondary education. And therefore, what you really need is someone that can effectively communicate ideas that no matter how you did in your university class, or even if you did not go to university, you understand. Therefore, the idea that these have to be incredibly intelligent teachers does not stand. And also, we tell you that the type of person that likes spending lots of time in the library and doing really well at university is most likely, not always, there are exceptions, but is most likely someone who does not like as much kind of socializing or engaging with little children. So we tell you that these people tend to not have their skills best matched. Now on to the idea of forcing. So that I will offer a kind of different principal case to what we heard from the Prime Minister. So what is the precedent for this? The precedent for this is war. Okay, this is where this kind of conscription happens. We tell you that nowadays, even in cases of war, people do not support conscription. People would not kind of like be happy with this happening. And also, we tell you this is not a situation which is anywhere as extreme as war, and so it does not kind of warrant this kind of coercion. 2 seconds, the timer's going off. Yeah, so we got the point from the Prime Minister about the idea of coercion from the state. We tell you that there generally is no precedent for this. The way that the state tends to coerce is through things like taxes. This is very, very different because it coerces, but it does not reduce the freedom of choice or autonomy of the people involved. That's fundamentally what we tell you is more important. I need to take a POI. If anybody's got a POI from down table, please go for it.
How does this affect the way that graduates act after they leave the school?
We tell you that, well, I will come on to this quickly, but we tell you that this mostly leads them to being really pissed off because they feel like they're having to be forced to do things. Okay, so let's actually engage with this now. So we tell you that teachers will tend to put in less effort. Why? Firstly, because they're forced to. Secondly, because they feel that they are doing less hard work than they are capable of doing, and this will annoy them. We tell you that they will also be annoyed because they're earning less comparatively than they would be, and therefore what this turns out to be, and this turns out principally and practically, it looks like they're punishing. Therefore we see, because teachers feel like they're being punished to do this, they do not have all the incentives the Prime Minister spoke about to be like incredibly altruistic and create better results for people. Therefore we see that we get worse standards of teaching on our side for both primary and secondary education, and we tell you on the as I've taken down the principle of the Prime Minister and showed our principle forcing is illegitimate. So for all these reasons, I beg you to oppose.
We thank the speaker for his speech, and I'm super happy to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hi, can I have 10 seconds?
That's fine, but make it very short.
Hi, am I audible and visible? All right, perfect. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think it's important at the beginning of the speech to establish how really bad the comparative is, right? Because the world that opening opposition wants to preclude from you, the world that they think is so convenient and so good with teachers that are better than students in the way that they teach the curriculum and all of these very marginal claims that they give you, which aren't backed up in the first place, is a world where you have vulnerable, uneducated, rundown areas, right? The reason why these are areas of low socioeconomic growth in the first place is because the individuals in these areas have for centuries and decades have existed in situations of cyclical and generational poverty, right? Either you have individuals, kids, high school students, individuals who have situations where they don't have schools, situations where they have run down schools, or situations where they have schools where they have the capacity to learn, but they don't have the teachers to teach them. More often than not, the individuals teaching in these schools are government recruits, individuals recruited from like civil services or individuals recruited from like national clearing exams, etc., who either don't have the capability to work in these areas, either don't have the incentive to work in these areas, or are merely doing so as a mandate because it's a job and something that gives them a pension and something that gives them a steady salary, right? More often than not, these are situations where these individuals need some kind of recourse. These are situations where these individuals are desperate for a situation that gets them out of the situation that they find themselves in, a situation that gets them out of the desperate cycle that they find themselves in. Our world gives you that, right? Our world gives you a change, our world gives you a perspective, and our world gives you a comparative. Don't let them fool you to believe that these teachers are going to get these students out of the situations that they're in when they never really mechanized you how that's going to happen. Many things that we told you in our speech, right? But two main questions. Why is this policy necessary enough to justify taking students away for 2 years, to justify taking them away from their education and putting them in these new positions? And secondly, why are educated students in the best position to do this? Before I move on to these claims, I want to deal with the strings of rebuttal that I have or whatever I get from opening opposition's case, right? Firstly, is this idea that this is non-consensual for students, even though Shalem explicitly models out to you at the start of our policy that students are going to be aware of this, right? Which is to say that when they enter the university process, this is something that they opt into. I don't think this is a claim that makes much sense. But on the idea of networks, right? On the idea of like, are students actually going to give these networks? Are students actually going to give individuals this impetus, et cetera, right? At the point at which students are young and inexperienced in the way the opposition claim. We challenge this premise, right? We think the students do have networks at the point at which they spend 4 years of undergraduate education interacting with, as they concede, high-level faculty, individuals who have massive influence in a lot of fields, individuals who work in social research and public policy, individuals who have all of these impacts that actually accrue in the long run, right? What you do in university involves large amounts of community service. But we think that even if we take them at their best and individuals and these students don't have networks, we think that these individuals will have networks in the future. Why is this important? Because Shalem explicitly models out to you why these students are going to come back and give back to these communities, why they're more incentivized to like not go and brain drain and work in another country, to not go and do jobs which don't impact the communities, why they're more likely to do work that impacts these communities in the future, which means that whatever networks they accrue in the future by virtue of their education are then going to come back to these low socioeconomic areas, which means that the impacts are not marginal, but incredibly huge at the point at which you consider the long term and the short term. But on average, we think that the network they have is always going to be more than a random government employee who doesn't have any incentive to benefit these people in the first place. On this idea that the rounded teacher is a better role model, we completely challenge this claim no matter how marginal it is. At the point at which you have a more educated university student who has an incentive to do this, as we've established, they're more likely to help these individuals anyway, right? There are these other points about the curriculum, right? At the point at which opening opposition tells us that people won't understand what these students teach, that you're going to have a situation where in primary schools, you need better kinds of educators who don't teach curriculum in complex ways, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know how exactly we like are marginally going to deal with this, but I would tell you that these are claims that are not true in the first place, right? At the point at which people are going to understand what students teach, to the extent that students are going to be made to teach in ways that are amenable to these students in the first place. And if students aren't cut out for the job, you're going to give the job to someone else who's better equipped to teach, right? There are students who literally study education. The model, the motion, it explicitly frames students who study specific kinds of majors and specific kinds of policies who are in a capacity to teach these individuals. But more specifically, right, we want to tell you that teaching is not about curriculums or anything like that, because everybody is capable of teaching. The impact of this policy is the attention that students bring to these areas, right? The policy changes that they can bring to these areas, which are incredibly crucial, right? We don't think it's a precedent for war or a precedent for anything of that magnitude. We think it's a precedent for success. We think it's a precedent for attention, and we think this benefits the students. On to the questions. Why is this policy necessary enough to justify taking students away for 2 years, right? Firstly, Shalem gave you points about development, how this increases literacy, jobs, GDP per capita, et cetera, and why this then gives governments an economic incentive to do this in the first place, which means you have less structural bureaucratic administration, et cetera, how this prevents brain drain. But secondly, and very importantly, and I think this is where the debate really lies, why are educated students in the best position to do this, right? Firstly, we told you that they voice opinions, right? They're more likely to see the impacts that happen in these regions and then change policy as a result of this. We told you that they have a network and that they bring investment and that they bring expertise to the area. But more specifically, they're role models, right? Specifically, why? Because when you have individuals from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, students in these universities largely comprise of low socioeconomic backgrounds as well, right? You see this in the best universities and the worst universities of the world, where you have individuals who have made it just by working, where you have individuals who have made it just by pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and who know the capacity and who have the capability to impart these same values to students. These are students who have been in the positions where they've struggled for their education and hence have a duty to impart those same values to students. Note that the motion explicitly says that these are students who are in the top 5% of their cohorts, which means explicitly they have strong academic motives to do so in the first place anyway, right? But on the idea of benefit, right, we think that then these students know the best way to benefit these individuals. But lastly, very importantly, why are these students more likely to invest time and resources towards benefiting these individuals? Why they are likely to actually pay attention to these jobs in the first place and actually do them in a good way, right? Firstly, we think that you have a better incentive structures for students than for government employees, at the point in which working in social research is more likely to give you jobs in research and academia, as I'll expand on in the final substantive. But also in general, the students get a greater sense of purpose from this, and individuals at that sense of at that year and at that socioeconomic level really need that sense of purpose. Secondly, we think at the point at which you have governments and universities, et cetera, you're going to have incentives from these institutions in the first place, at the point in which governments are more likely to offer you jobs when you work in them in the first place. Universities are more likely to offer you redistributive programs where you teach students in universities at the point in which they know that you're capable of teaching socioeconomically disadvantaged students in other areas. But thirdly and importantly, you're more likely to get jobs that are oriented towards social research and public policy at the point in which you have this policy. Why and why do we want this, right? We think that at the point at which students spend 2 years of their lives, the minute they come out of university, teaching these individuals about the values of life, teaching these individuals about life sciences and all of these things, that you increase a culture that does not want materialism, right? At the point at which individuals stop being self-interested about their careers and decide to focus their careers on individuals who are disadvantaged, etc., you spend 2 years making an impact, right? Which means at the point at which this impact isn't something that you necessarily opted into, not something that you didn't have expectations for, or nothing to lose in that regard, you move out of this purposeless, shallow notion of your career, right? You're more likely to see societal woe and want to resolve it, which means you're more likely to move into careers which influence research, which influence academia, which influence social research and public policy, because you've seen the benefits that a career in this could possibly have. You've seen the marginal impacts of helping your own community because you had an explicit duty to do so, and you were put in a position where you were made to do so, which means you're more likely to impact social welfare in a much better way, which means you get more jobs that don't deal with like corporatist Wall Street interests, but jobs that deal with actually benefiting the communities that these people come from, which means on the aggregate, you benefit individuals from these areas, you benefit students, and you give governments an incentive to keep continuing this policy. We win. We're incredibly proud to propose.
We thank the speaker for the speech, and I please remind you all the speeches are 7 minutes. And with that being said, I'm super happy to welcome the deputy leader of the opposition. Here.
Okay, I'd prefer points of information in the chat. And I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in my speech panel. Firstly, some extraneous rebuttal. Secondly, how other measures to plug the teaching shortage stop happening. And third, how people from developing countries are significantly less likely to return. So actually, the brain drain intensifies. Right, 2 things of extraneous rebuttal. Firstly, on role models. 3 responses. I think these people are likely to be phoning it in. My partner proved this. They have so many incentives to not be trying their hardest. They hate the fact that they've got a pay cut because these are the top 5% of performers. They think that they deserve to be earning much more money than this. They're not trying their hardest. Second, these people as role models are so unrealistic that these kids will think it's entirely unattainable. I don't think that showing the most underprivileged people, the most privileged people, are going to make them think that that's a legitimate attainable role model. Social mobility tends to be much more incremental than that. You could perhaps go from someone who is in a family who's never attended university to showing someone who's like gone to college, and then someone who's like gone to a university, and then someone who's graduated like top 5% Oxford. I think there's a huge, I think incrementalism is very relevant here. You don't get that from Gov. Third, I think that these people as teachers will be stigmatized by classrooms because of their groupthink. Note the personality traits that being a massive SWAT breeds. They're not the most interpersonal, they're more socially awkward, and also younger teachers always get most stigmatized anyway. These people are young, they're overly academic, and they're probably quite socially awkward. These classrooms will eat them alive. Right. Second piece of rebuttal, how do we think that this will affect graduates' act after they leave the school? Responding to this CGPOI, I think actually they're probably likely to leave with unfair stereotypes about the ways in which kids in deprived areas act. Because I mentioned that these people are going to be stigmatized to some extent, they won't be caring much about the lessons, the kids probably won't treat them with too much respect. And then because of this, these people then think, oh damn, all these stereotypes about these places are true. I think that's actually awful, and it's terrible for social cohesion. Right, first piece of substantive. What are the other measures to plug the teaching shortage? Because that's the main problem that's trying to be dealt with here. I think there's 2 ways that are happening or could happen. 1, individual acts of altruism and commitment, and 2, grants to groups in other areas. For example, uni graduates who are less academically proficient but have demonstrated interpersonal proficiency or commitment to underprivileged areas. I think the reason that this policy comes about is because the government are trying to solve a problem of a teacher shortage. And by the time that this policy policies implemented, there's a consistent stream of teachers plugging up this problem. But I think that this is like shoving Play-Doh in a wall that really needs plaster so it appears filled, but then it's actually a terrible wall and it's not doing the job it needs to, but people don't notice this. So at the point where this problem becomes less apparent, two things happen. One, on an individual level, people have one less reason to become teachers. So you see the number of people who elect to become teachers drop. Two, on a governmental level, there are significantly less funds for groups which aim to get prospective teachers of a different profile into this type of employment. The comparative we're working here is why do we prefer these two other actors who have demonstrated are now becoming teachers at lower rates? The teachers under this motion are A, uncommitted, and B, incompetent. Three reasons we were told why these teachers under the motion actually would be committed. I'll rebut them now. A, they're responsible citizens. B, they want to boost their CV. And C, they have a duty. I don't think they'll be responsible when they're working for a job with significantly less pay in a community they almost definitely don't relate to, in a career they never intended to do. Second, on the CV, two responses. One, their CVs are already among the best in the country. And two, their CV will get a boost from doing the program, but doing it well will yield little marginal gains. So there's no reason why they do it well. Third, on their duty, I expect the committed individuals who opt in to pay cuts being a teacher necessitates, acting from altruism, will be more committed and will feel much more of a duty. Okay, let's talk about other programs that may exist but don't happen because of this motion. These look like either people who worked in uni organizations that showed a commitment to underprivileged areas like charities, etc., or people who are able to demonstrate proficiency interpersonally in universities, like demonstrating they can control a classroom. Why are these skills so much more important? 4 reasons, or maybe 3, who knows. 1, in high school, and especially in primary
sorry, I will have to stop you there. Let's just see if the deputy leader of opposition is inaudible only for me or for everyone else.
The same.
Okay, so I stopped the time at 4:59, even though I think it was a couple of seconds before that. Let's see if they dropped from the call.
Hello, is my internet working?
Yeah, now we can hear you. It was off
Okay.
for a sec.
So where did I stop? I think I stopped why these skills are more important.
Yeah, exactly. It was 4:59 at my clock.
Okay, I'll restart in 3, 2, 1. Right. Reasons why these skills are more important. A, I think high schools and primary schools need these interpersonal skills more to control the classroom, because B, that the actual academics of school, not very difficult. Most people in uni probably can grasp them and teach them at a very competent level. The top 5% thing is completely unnecessary. And it's only these other groups of people that have those relevant skills. Since their funding has dropped, groups which teach more relevant skills, these stop getting funding. Way less of these people go in because it's being flooded by people who are overly academic and don't have the interpersonal skills. I'll take closing government, yes.
Insofar as it's true that these teachers in these circumstances will be forced to actually interact with people on a one-to-one individual basis, isn't it significantly more likely that they're more likely to decrease any sort of negative stereotypes rather than increase them?
I don't think much teaching actually happens on a one-to-one basis, especially on a big classroom, underprivileged areas. I think most teaching here is very big groups, possibly 30, 35 people. What happens is groupthink, what happens is stigmatization, what happens is these people looking at this young, vulnerable, nerdy teacher and thinking they're basically not a one level above a supply teacher. That breeds stigma. Okay, developing countries. People come from developing countries to developed countries because there are better universities there. On a principle level, I think these people have a stake to their original country more than the country they moved to for uni, right? On a practical level, these people are being asked to stay in their country, in the country of their university. This means A, they're probably going to have to move away from their university to move to the underprivileged area, and B, they're probably going to have to get a more permanent residence. These people are now rooting themselves in this newer country, so they're significantly less likely to return to the country they come from. We value these people's ability to bring their skills and expertise back to their home countries from universities over helping underprivileged areas in these developed countries, because we don't want the brain drain to happen, and these underprivileged areas in developed countries have other forms of access. For all these reasons, please vote opening up.
We thank the speaker for their speech, and I'm super happy to have a member of government here.
Just making sure I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Awesome. I'll take POIs in the chat if that's possible. Look, panel, I think it's probably true that most people would be fine teachers. I don't think the change that happens in this debate is whether or not you have a marginally better person or worse person teaching you mathematics. What we tell you is probably true is you have a way better school now. You have a structurally better place to support you. And that economy that you'll graduate from high school into if you're a low-income student will be significantly better for you, one that is far more tailored to your needs and your desires. I'm going to do a couple of things in this speech. First of all, I'm going to briefly engage with the top half clash about whether or not teachers are better within the classroom context and tell you why it probably is not going to be super significant, and government probably takes that regardless. And then I'm going to walk you through why society is structurally better from the poor, both within schools and within the economy at large. And then I'll talk you through why that is the biggest impact in today's debate and why you should vote for us because of it. Why do we tell you that we think that teachers are probably going to be relatively fine under our side of the house? What we think that these teachers are going to have is a couple of things. First of all, I think the most important bit of characterization that the OG was missing is how universities adapt. Because what we tell you is two things. First of all, universities don't want to lose their absolute top students to international colleges. So what we tell you is they're going to try and make sure these teaching programs prepare them so they don't have an awful time. We tell you that people want to do broadly well in their jobs. They want to do things where they feel like they're actively giving back. So they're going to do things in class, like teaching people interpersonal skills, like more group work tasks, like little seminars in your final year of school for students that are likely to graduate as 5%, about how to do things like teaching, how to engage in a classroom setting. We tell you there is a structural incentive for these schools to prepare people to be good teachers, so they're probably going to try and prepare people. We also think that schools don't want to be blasted in the New York Times for for having graduates that are terribly racist and terribly awful people. We tell you that means that we're going to similarly do these things, but also they're going to do things like have more classes that weed out bad social attitudes. They're going to try and make sure that they're not having teachers that graduate with particularly stigmatizing attitudes towards the poor. That necessarily means having more classes which are graded that focus on things like social attitudes, focus on social issues. We think that's not only good because you have good teachers, we think that also has significant flow-on effects at the point that you're more actively prioritizing teaching things like interpersonal skills, more actively prioritizing teaching things like good social attitudes. That's almost debate-winning framing within itself. We tell you just have better people coming out of university. But we also just think there's a couple of things just are true. We tell you that these people are probably quite smart. They're probably able to engage on a personal level. They're young. They probably have a lot of energy. They're able to connect with these people one-to-one. We think that probably means they're just going to be relatively good teachers. And thirdly, we think the assertion that came from OO that that people who are smart are holed up in their rooms all day is just functionally untrue. We tell you that every student by nature of going to university has to make friends, has to deal with weird social situations, has to do things like group projects, has to engage with teachers, and potentially has to do things like research and internships. I think that's fine analysis from OG. We tell you therefore at the end of the day that maybe you do get OG's characterization of slightly better teachers, but we tell you broadly it's just probably true that the quality of teachers is relatively symmetric. Why do we tell you, therefore, that what you get is your massive benefits to the poor? Why do you structurally change society? Two things here. First of all, you completely overhaul schools. Right now, what we tell you is that oftentimes in low-income areas, there are a couple of problems with structural school administration. First of all, what we tell you is you're cycling in and out of the worst teachers of the thing, because we tell you that when teachers can choose what public school they go into, they probably start their career in relatively low-income schools, and then they work their way up to the top public and private schools in the country, because we tell you those schools, A, require the least work, B, are the most administratively easy, and 3, probably exist in communities where they personally feel safe. We tell you most teachers happen to be Like white, we tell you they probably go in with like racial and class biases that mean that they don't want to exist in these schools. So what you have is like probably the worst teachers, graduating teachers colleges, being run by an incredibly burnt out administration who lacks good ideas and oftentimes doesn't particularly care about these students because of how much stress and how little funding they're getting. What happens here? First of all, you just have an injection of energy, because what you have is you have a bunch of people coming out of college who are like particularly excited about going into the workforce, who have particularly strong skills and have a lot of innovation. This means a couple things. First of all, you begin to like mitigate burnout, because having like fun conversations in the teacher's lounge just means that you're going to go into a job with a bit more energy. You're actually excited to be there in the first instance. That hugely changes the culture of teachers. You're far less likely to have angry, aggressive teachers that overpunish minority students and like underteach them skills. They're just now better at their jobs. Second of all, you get a lot more innovation in terms of how you run the school, because what you have is you have a bunch of really diverse candidates. This is like totally underdealt with by top half. Because now you have a school where you have a bunch of people that study things like business administration and politics who can go into the school and be like, oh, what I see here is the structural problems we have studied with systematic racism in the way that we punish students. I think we should have a conversation as a teachers group about how we reform punishment so that A, it gets better results, and B, it impacts minority students less. When you're able to enter conversations with people that are specifically trained on how to have those conversations, you just have better policy in terms of how these things work, compared to status quo where you only have people coming out of teachers' colleges where they're unlikely to be trained on how to have these conversations. But second of all, it's secondary things. Like you have like engineers who are able to come in and like build teachers, like children think like cool little tree houses where they can like play in PE classes, where you have more interesting ideas on how to do things because you have someone who graduated like with a chemistry degree who just like knows a particularly like sick experiment which they can do like fun demonstrations in on class. We tell you that means you just have a lot more structural administration, and you also have teachers who learn new skills and new fun ways to engage with them. I'll take closing now if they have a POI.
Look, I think the teachers that are most likely to work in low socioeconomic regions are ones that have proximity towards a cause. And so far as they're proximate, I think you're going to get more innovation because they understand the structural challenges that these socioeconomic regions then like face. Why isn't the comparative better on your side of the house?
Look, we think what happens is that those people don't enter teaching school because teaching school is highly exclusionary. It requires you to like get relatively good grades in high school. It's probably hard to access if you're low income. But secondly, we tell you there's also like, it's probably just like middle class people mostly, because we tell you that like if you're lower class and have access to that sort of economic mobility of university, you have like relatively low prestige. And which is the last reason we tell you get better things. Because what happens right now is you just like don't have many good people entering teaching school. Teaching is a low prestige job because of those things, like they're highly bureaucratic. They have really burnt out people and that sort of thing. At the point that you see that in your schools, like half of the teachers are going to be like highly energetic, super smart people who you can have really fun conversations with, you're probably more likely to see that as a highly prestigious area, because you can have those stimulating conversations, because you see it as somewhere where you can career progress, we can have those kinds of like, you can build networks, that kind of thing. We tell you that means you just have more interesting people entering teaching school. That means that in the long term, you have more people. But I think the second thing here is you necessarily get better changes in business. I think Jackson will do a better job at this than I am, but what we tell you is at the point that you have people exiting these things, you have more one-to-one interactions with structural problems on the ground. OG told you this means that they vote better. We tell you this is far more important because then they go do things like enter Goldman Sachs, when they go like run an engineering firm, we tell you that they're more likely to like take those decisions and understanding that they take both culturally, because we tell you that minority groups oftentimes are highly raced, highly cultured. So like these are people with like different mindsets that are often ignored by the white majority. They're bringing in those mindsets with them. But second of all, they're just like more likely to care about minority issues. They understand the problems on the ground. That makes them better workers. This just beats all the material of top half, far better impacts side by side CG.
We think that's the recorded speech, and I'm super happy to welcome a member of the opposition. Here.
Great. So if you've got any POIs, can you please give them in the chat? Okay, so two things here. Firstly, some framing and mitigation, which explains how we are actually likely to get worse education on your side of the house. Secondly, a substantive point and actually providing the practical case for why we get a worsened economy and intellectual industry on the whole under your side of the house. Okay, firstly, rebuttal from what we've just heard. Okay, so what have we really got so far from the teams in the government? Okay, so I think we really get this first point, which hasn't been challenged by our opening, about whether uni students are likely to know in advance that they are likely to engage in these courses. Note, I think people only actually know that they're in the top 5% of graduates at the point in which they've actually finished their course. Therefore, when they go into university, I think it's unlikely that they will think that is likely to be the case at the point in which achieving like that level of success and being in the 5% is probably extremely difficult. Therefore, I'm unlikely to think that I'm able to achieve that. Ultimately, I don't think that's really true. Note that I think they are likely to actively try and avoid this at the point at which you incentivize them not being forced to get drafted into this like teaching scheme. Ultimately, I think that leads to worse education, the point at which people are likely to sabotage their grades in order to decrease them to avoid this draft. Secondly, this idea of over whether the government has a responsibility to these lower socioeconomic areas. Look, firstly, I think this is entirely dependent on the opening government actually winning the quality of the teaching class, which I don't think they do. I'm going to explain why that's not true. Secondly, I'm not necessarily sure why this is actually true in this debate, right? Because I think the government has a responsibility to all in society, but no, I think it also, most importantly, has a responsibility to specifically develop its own capabilities. This looks like the development of the economy. This looks like the development of its academia as a whole. I think at the point at which we are uniquely able to do that under our side of the house, we are winning this debate, right? Third thing, big mechanism that we really get is this idea about networking. Look, I think at the point at which the students are likely to be resentful because they're robbed of their 50 grand starting job at companies like McKinsey, I think they're likely to deprioritize the support for these students. They're likely to not engage in this kind of networking. Note that I think these students are significantly more likely to be privileged. As a result of that, I think they have less empathy for these people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. I also think they have less relatability to them and therefore are significantly less likely to network. Why do you think that our networks that we build on our side of the house are comparatively better? Note that I think that on your side of the house, these networks are built specifically within the academic elite which these students are part of. Comparatively, I think on our side, when we employ specialist teachers, we think that we are able to get the kind of networking which actually helps people escape poverty. For example, through protection and support through poverty, through violence, things that significantly affects these communities as a whole. Then, okay, let's talk about the CG. And really the main substantive we get from them is this interjection of energy. Look, note, I think that these students likely are probably going to be resentful as a result of that. I'm not really sure why they are so energetic in the first place, right? Secondly, let's talk about this. Like, I think we can also claim this impact on our side of the house, right? Because at the point at which, as I'm going to explain in our case, government funding ultimately decreases as a whole because of the decrease in tax revenue, because of the impact of this motion on the economic output of the country as a whole. I think we, at the point at which we neglect this talent, I think we lose this economic capability, we lose this funding. Ultimately, I think at that point, it is harder to fund specialists and most importantly in this debate, permanent teachers, right? Because I think we have an exponential increase in impact here because ultimately the teachers that we train under our side of the house are likely to have a 60-year career ahead of them instead of just the 2 years that they comparatively get. Look, at the point at which that is the case, I think we're likely to be able to get the government to fund these new teachers, right? Who are specifically motivated because they represent these communities and therefore more likely to inject this energy, but also do it over a longer, more sustainable period. Okay, let's go on to, get on to firstly this mitigation and framing, which note that I think this is essential for OO's case to actually stand, right? Okay, so I think these graduates are unlikely to be good teachers, right? So they're specifically unlikely to be good teachers for these kids that are from these low socioeconomic backgrounds. Why do I think this is the case? Look, firstly, I think being good at school does not actually make you a good teacher, right? Because a student largely has to prove their understanding of a content to a professor. In comparison, I think you have to have a teacher which has to explain its content into an easy way. Note that I think that all people can understand. I think this is especially important, the point in which lower socioeconomic backgrounds, kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have specific difficulties which teachers have to challenge. Look, I think that ultimately, I don't think these two talents are necessarily inclusive. In fact, I think they're actively exclusive at the point at which selecting for people's understanding, selecting for people's ability to prove their understanding ultimately leads them to go excessively into depth into topics, which makes it harder to explain them. Secondly, in terms of teaching these low income and specifically primary areas, I think they're unlikely to be good. Let's talk about the challenges these kids face. Look, they face things like violence, they face things like poverty. I think they face things like the lack of role model outside their own parents. How do we actually combat this in schools, right? I think the government is actually able to fulfill its responsibility here when it hires its own specialist teachers. Note that I think these teachers have a higher motivation at the point at which they're from analogous backgrounds and they're good at interpersonal skills, socialization, childcare, all the things that we actually need to make us successful teachers. Why do I think that these 5% of graduates are not good at this, right? First, we have to analyze what they actually look like. I think they look like students who don't have to juggle multiple jobs in order to get through university. I think they look like students who have had an exceptional early education because their parents are rich. It looks like those students who haven't been able to have access to the finance to get access to things like tutoring and so on. Ultimately, this leads to this 5% being disproportionately privileged and therefore least likely to actually be able to come from these areas. Therefore, I think they're least likely to be able to relate to these students and are uniquely incapable of actually dealing with the problems they have. No, then CG attempts to mitigate this by basically telling us that universities will somehow improve their ability to make these teachers in the first place. Look, I think this is likely not true when the universities don't have the capability to do this on two levels. A, I think they can't teach something, which is, I think they can't actually teach what is necessary for these students to have, right? Because I think these teachers need lived experience in order to engage with these children. At the point in which these 5% don't actually have that lived experience, you can't teach that. B, I don't think they actually have the capacity to do this, because this would require a massive expansion of, for example, teaching specific schools, which they don't engage with under the status quo. Ultimately, I think their lack of current capability, combined with the lack of incentive to do so, makes them less likely to do that. Why do I think they don't have an incentive? Because I think the incentive of universities is primarily to extract money. As a result of that, the point at which students are likely to think they can get out of this draft by flunking their grades, there therefore is no incentive for the university to actually invest in this kind of teaching. Okay, finally, let's talk about some brief framing about this practical look. So I think the economic success in a country is almost always accompanied by some sort of intellectual or academic dominance, right? And ultimately, and secondly, I think that this intellectual dominance is largely driven by this top 5% of students. Why do I think this is the case? Because they're generally capable of making groundbreaking ideas, they're capable of effective leadership, and they're globally competitive. Look, at the point at which this teaching is analogous to some kind of national services, I think there's significant damages to these students' education to the point at which they cannot actually recover. Firstly, I think this impacts during a crucial development stage, i.e. their transition from a degree towards some sort of PhD or academia, or into some kind of further education, or into a job. Look, I think this 2-year degree ultimately makes these candidates less attractive at the point at which they are distracted by engaging in this education, but they also lose this financial reward. Ultimately, I don't think their incentivization is improved. I think the impacts of this are basically that there's just less talent in sectors like science, technology, and art. We lose talent in sectors like medicine, and ultimately we extend the brain drain. I think at that point we win this debate.
Fantastic. Am I audible?
Waiting the speaker for that speech. Yes, you are audible. I would just like to remind everyone that speeches should not be longer than 7 minutes. And with that being said, I'm super happy to welcome the government. Here.
Fantastic. Panel, this round fundamentally asks us to answer 4 basic questions. First, what are the obligations of this House? Second, how does this policy affect students in these low socioeconomic status areas? Third, how does this actually change the teachers in the program after they leave the program? And how does that affect society as a whole? And fourth and finally, how does this fundamentally change the university structures to lead to a better society? And I will prove to you within this speech that on all 4 of those metrics, closing government is clearly winning. First, a bit of extraneous rebuttal to CO. So what CO essentially tells us is that these people are inherently unlikely to be good teachers. What they tell us is inherently you need some sort of lived experience to actually be able to be effective teachers within these societies. However, what Millie tells you is a lot of the teachers that currently teach within these low socioeconomic status areas are teachers who are not coming from those areas because there is inherently an economic barrier to be able to get into teaching school in the first place. So therefore, the teachers predominantly come from middle incomes, and so therefore they don't even have these lived experiences anyways. So CO's own metric of what makes an effective teacher in these areas just fundamentally falls through. But the more basic misunderstanding of the CO case is they fundamentally misunderstand and mischaracterize the actual nature of a lot of these schools in these low socioeconomic status areas. They do this in a couple of key ways. First, they essentially just try and tell us that these schools are great things, the government does a great job, it looks out for the interests of these groups. If that is true, then why is it also objectively true that we have seen demonstrably that there are societal systems of inequity within these communities that lead to worse educational outcomes for the individuals that happen in these low socioeconomic status areas? If you buy CO's argument that the government is doing a great job, then you wouldn't see this. The truth is that these people are getting a worse education in these low socioeconomic areas. The government is not doing a good job. So then this comes to the question of does this policy actually lead to meaningfully better outcomes? And it does it in a couple of key ways, which Millie described. So essentially, they come down to a lot of different things. CO tries to mischaracterize our arguments as just talking about the energy of the students. That's not what we're talking about. But to further explain a little bit more, there's a couple of different reasons that this happens. So when these teachers are actually entering these environments, they're significantly more educated than a lot of the teachers that currently exist in these environments. That's the first reason. Second reason, a lot of the teachers that currently exist in these areas with low socioeconomic status are extraordinarily burnt out. They simply engage in whatever academic structure that already exists. Again, these are academic structures which are inherently classist and racist against a lot of minority and marginalized groups. Insofar as it's true that these individuals that are coming from the top 5% of universities would, inherently have different ideas of what it means to actually get an education, then these teachers, which like hate their jobs, are burnt out, structurally don't have any resources, structurally like just do not want to do a good job for their students, we see a couple of key things. So this next comes down to like the key argument of how does this structurally make the schools better in these low socioeconomic status areas. This is one of the key arguments in this round, because if CG can prove that we uniquely show you how these schools improve, then we win the round outright, because we have proven like the biggest impact towards the quality of life of these marginalized groups. So how does CG attempt to prove that these individuals like changes these schools? A couple of key ways. So first, we directly like give you a lot of analysis about how there's a lot of innovation in like how the way these schools are operated. And what happens essentially is that like there's a huge amount of diverse perspectives from a lot of different fields coming in that have like different ideas about how different school systems should be structured, versus just having like a completely homogenous teacher population coming from a teaching school that tends to be a middle income teachers. We instead have a non-homogenous population of people that are like coming from these universities. So on this point of like people coming from these universities, let's like address this characterization of what they look like. Will they be resentful of their time in the teaching stint? How will it affect them in the long run? So what we hear from opposition throughout today's round is essentially like these people are incredibly privileged individuals. And while like this definitely is true to some extent, the actual analysis of long-term how this impacts those individuals is completely mishandled by every other team in today's round. So the fundamental like characterization of what happens to these teachers by every other round is essentially they say like they have privilege, they'll continue having privilege, nothing happens, privilege is bad. The fundamental thing they don't understand is in a teaching experience, even if you're dealing with a group, teaching inherently necessitates a massive number of one-on-one interactions. These individuals, a lot of those in the top 5% are coming from incredibly privileged backgrounds. This is true. And thus, inherently, a lot of them will have like certain social stigmas, certain stereotypes of like how these communities operate, what these communities look like. By actually forcing them over long periods of time to interact on a like personal level with these individuals, the actual like probability of them like keeping the same stigma or even increasing the stigma is negligible to none. What you actually see is when they're forced to like actually interact with the individual students in these areas, students are like inherently an incredibly sympathetic group. What happens is they change these structures. They change these stereotypes about what these students look like. Why is that important? Why is it important that we change those structures? Insofar as it's true that this top 5% carries incredible privilege within society, we think that it is necessarily true that even after this teaching stint, they will gain positions of great power within society. This looks like politician roles, this looks like roles within business, this looks like roles in every single aspect of society. The response to this by CEO is essentially like they're less attractive candidates. Even if like they're marginally less attractive candidates, which is number one, untrue, they're more attractive candidates. We see that like the work environment is shifting towards like prioritizing a lot of diverse experiences. So this is actually something that is prioritized. This is attractive, not unattractive. Second, the reason that like all of this is important, so we have these individuals which come from privilege. They change a lot of their stereotypes in the time in which they're in these school communities in low socioeconomic areas. So then what happens when they regain these positions of great power later on? So inherently, let's say that like an individual is going to become like the president of a massive corporation. At the point at which like they have directly interacted and have a personal relationship where they like email a student that they really, really care about in this community, they're substantially less likely to institute structural policies of oppression, racism, and classism. I'll take briefly.
Your partner said teachers will be enthusiastic enough to perform unpaid labor here. Why can only the top 5% do this? And why would people otherwise earning double this salary even care?
So, I mean, a couple of things. Number one, as I like directly characterized earlier in the speech, this like enthusiasm isn't the key point of our case. And secondarily, like they're not unpaid labor. Like it directly mentions in the motion that like this is paid as any other job is. Like that just has nothing to do with any of our case. So now moving on to like fundamental weighing why CO wins this round. So first, why do we beat opening government? Well, it's true that like there's individual impacts within these communities when the teachers are there. It's significantly more important to look at structural systems of oppression, racism, and classism. And insofar as CG has proven to you that it's true that these individuals that like go into these communities will have massive power later on within the rest of society. And because they're like exposed to these students and individual circumstances, they're significantly likely to actually change these systems. They're also significantly likely to change the actual structure of these schools to make these schools better. These are things that OG failed to do. The reason we beat OO is we give you a significantly better, more mechanized analysis about like what these teachers actually look like, what their incentive structures are, and how they actually operated within society. And finally, the reason that CG like takes it over CO is CO is like just fundamentally mistaken about like what these schools look like. They're operating on this like completely mischaracterized notion of like schools right now are great. The truth is schools are super shitty. They're really bad. They're racist. They're classist. We need something to change it. I've given you lots of mechanistic reasons why this is a better solution. For all these reasons, I'm happy to urge a vote in government.
We thank the speaker for the speech, and I'm very happy to welcome the opposition whip to close this debate as a whole. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Panel, 3 things in this speech. Firstly, an analysis of our framing. Secondly, 14 pieces of refutation against the government bench. Lastly, some weighing in the speech and as to why Dom's extension on CO takes this debate. Firstly, let's do some like reframing of this debate. I think we already talked about this framing in CO, but I'd like to preemptively bring it up before I begin my speech. Firstly, I think we need to characterize why these people in academia are likely to be bad teachers. And we've given you 3 reasons for that. Firstly, I don't think academia teaches you the necessary teaching skills you would otherwise require to be a good teacher. Secondly, I think high performance at university often means that you're in a state of privilege, right? I don't think this is ultimately going to enable you to interact with kids who exist in low socioeconomic regions. And ultimately, you're going to get shitty teaching on their side of the house, which is something I'm going to mechanize more in my speech. But lastly, I think teaching requires some sort of level of proximity and care, because I think ultimately as a teacher, you're a role model for these kids, specifically for those in low income areas. And I think to resolve those issues that exist within low socioeconomic areas, you require some degree of proximity. I think then we need to characterize what the comparative is on our side of the house and what we're ultimately defending. I think ultimately the individuals who go into teaching within these low income areas have 3 qualities. Firstly, I think they're proximate and relatable to the causes that exist within those areas. Secondly, they have an incentive for doing good because they're most likely to prioritize the social well-being of those kids. But lastly, they're likely to stay. And I think this is a really important point about longevity, which only comes up in Dom's extension. I'm going to expand on that more as I go throughout my case. But lastly, 9 pieces of refutation against the opening government. I think the first thing they tell you is that the government has a principle to better education. The first thing they tell you is education is contingent on the type of funding the government gets and gives in your area. So you have some burden of reciprocity. I think they also tell you that governments have the responsibility to fund low socioeconomic area education. 2 responses. Firstly, I think to the point at which the government gives you good education, right? I think your burden is reciprocated by your contribution to the economy, research, and politics. So I'm unconvinced why education is the delta to all this. But secondly, I think on this idea that governments have the responsibility to fund education, note that this is inherently symmetric insofar as grants funding and resource allocation can fix this problem either way. So on this idea about the practical, about how under their side of the house, you're going to use this political and economic capital to provide better quality of life to things like networking, getting funding for projects, and getting better quality of policy within those regions. 5 responses here. Firstly, I think insofar as you implement this policy, you allow the government to share their own responsibility to politically and economically advantage these regions, right? Because I think insofar as if you want those same benefits of having economic growth within those regions, the government can still do that on our side of the house. Second, I don't think they tell you what networking really looks like on their side of the house and why that's important. Third, I don't see why graduates within these cases have the incentives to do this in the first place. I think if you want good funding for good funding and grants to better these regions, I think it works better if you have teachers within these regions who are proximate to these regions to do so, because they're actively incentivized to improve those areas. But lastly, I think on the resentment point, I think ultimately you're going to have, on the networking point, you're ultimately going to have resentment that exists within these uni students insofar as they've had to give up a large source of their income. But you also actively have resentment from the students who just don't understand the type of position they're in. But lastly, the thing you get on the opening government side is this idea about you're going to get benefits to student because you get better quality education, but lastly you get education to be opportunities to be lifted out of poverty via education. 2 responses. Firstly, I think this is an assertive and non-nuanced, because I don't think they really consider why individuals are in poverty and this the burdens and the obstacles they face in the status quo to be lifted out of poverty. I think oftentimes poverty looks like being constrained by political and geographical factors, often areas of the high poverty have high correlations with things like violence and infrastructural funding. So I don't see why this motion is specifically the delta for lifting people out of poverty in the first place. But second, I think in terms of better quality education, I think education is less about knowledge and more about teaching, specifically to these individuals in low socioeconomic areas who require mentors and who require individuals who are more likely to help them through their personal circumstances as well. Before I move on to the CG case, I'll take a POI. Cool, moving on. Sure.
Okay. Even if all your mitigatory rebuttal is still true, the fact that they have one of the best CVs in their country, isn't it comparatively better than an underfunded government employee, which is a comparative on your side?
Look, I think the fact that they have a stacked CV is largely irrelevant to this debate. Insofar as teaching is less about how stacked of the CV you have, and ultimately like the social input you're able to add into the lives of these students. What do you get from CG then? Firstly, you get this like odd contention about this idea that you're going to inject energy and innovation, so burnout doesn't happen, you get more innovation. Like a myriad of responses to this. Firstly, I think this is largely symmetric. I don't see why like, you know, encouragement isn't going to happen on either side of the house. But like second, I think the type of innovation you get on their side of the house is homogenized and privileged. Because even if you buy the CG characterization that oftentimes the middle or lower economically class like are the individuals that are teaching in this region, you at least get better quality of innovation on our side of the house, insofar as these individuals are more proximate to the type of issues that exist within the socioeconomic regions. So I think that if the only thing that CG wants to focus on is this idea of innovation, know that this is entirely better on our side of the house. But I think ultimately the problem with the CG case is that they fail to understand why there's resentment towards education in low-income areas in the first place. So I'm unconvinced as to why enthusiasm and energy is like literally the most important delta in this debate. I think CG just takes it out of this debate. Like CG is just generally out of this debate. Okay, let's weigh against OO and talk about like the extension we bring you on CG. I think the first thing OO tells you is that like teaching is going to get worse because like ultimately the academics, like teaching is going to get worse. And ultimately the fact that these individuals who are coming to these regions to teach are ultimately like highly skilled academics. And you don't need that when you're trying to have like a good quality high school education. Look, I think this characterization generally washes on the top half because I think OG argues like the converse. They argue that a high-level education for people and students is ultimately the good thing. I think what's important in this debate then is the framing that we give you on CO as to why these elite students make bad teachers in like the most important context. That's where we give you our 3 lines of analysis. One, that academia doesn't give you relevant teaching skills. Second, high performance at uni doesn't mean that means that you are in a state of privilege and unable to interact with kids in low socioeconomic regions. But lastly, teaching requires some level of proximity and care that you only get on our side of the house. I think they also give you a point about unfairness and like unfairness on the principle. I think we're going to better mechanize that in the sense that like I'm going to move on to the CO extension. I think we give you 2 things. Firstly, about how you have a right to agency and intellectual freedom, because the concept of investing into school to have a good performance occurs when you have more freedom to manifest and pursue the path that you want to choose. But then we also give you a point about economic output, like that the people that exist within the status quo within that 5% are more likely to be knowledgeable within that subject. What are the 2 tipping points here? Firstly, I think the first tipping point is that economic and social output is severely damaged on the government side of the house because these people are likely to leave after 2 years. At that point, you get no networking and no long-term like productivity and benefits. That's the point at which we take down OG's impacts, even if you don't buy the mitigation analysis. But secondly, I think you get large forms of brain drain, right? I think to the point at which that happens, we win on OO's metric. I think even if graduates can provide, like graduates and these teachers can provide good economic and political capital, you're benefiting a state that already has a government to actively invest into these resources. That's the point at which you are unable to benefit developing nations proud to close the bench.